It's October 23rd, 2022, and we're talking about abortion. Again. Listen, I know there's a bunch of shit hitting the fan right now, like the House Select Committee on the January 6th attack voting unanimously, all 9 members in favor of subpoenaing the former president. We're talking exclusive news drops of a former aide saying that the one-pump president gave explicit instructions to relocate classified material and that there is surveillance footage to back up the allegation. We're talking Letitia James not putting up with a bunch of bullshit and filing a preemptive injunction against one giant douche trying to hide his assets. We're talking Alex Jones on the hook for $965 million. We're talking human trafficking of asylum seekers. We're talking Greg Abbott being a piss baby. We're talking Florida senators voting against disaster relief and then begging for fucking money. We're talking about the escalation of events in Ukraine to the point of risking the very real possibility of nuclear war. All these topics are great, and they're all getting a lot of attention. But we think the overturning of Roe v. Wade remains just as consequential. It remains worthy of our anger and attention. We owe it a much closer look. Let's get up to speed.
Do you believe in punishment for abortion? Yes or no, as a principle?
The answer is that there has to be some form of punishment.
For the woman?
Yeah, there has to be some form.
10 cents, 10 years,
I don't
what?
know. That I
Today,
don't know.
you can't run for dog catcher in Hazard County without stating your position on abortion.
Every House Democrat has voted for extreme policies, like taxpayer-funded abortion on demand until the point of birth. The people have won a victory.
Almost everyone that I spoke with said that they had one too. And I know that a lot of people don't agree with it, but honestly, it was the best decision that I could possibly make at the time.
The Supreme Court in 1972 ruled that the unborn are not human beings. They have no human or fundamental civil rights, not even the right to be born. And as a result, we slaughter them. We inject them with saline solution. We, with suction machines, pull them to pieces. And I think it's the national sin of America. It's biological holocaust. And there's a God in heaven who's angry at a society that's not doing something about it.
I'm here at Family Planning Camelback, seeking an abortion. And you only have a certain time frame now that they changed the law.
Every child is a precious and sacred gift from God.
The regret that I felt was that I wasn't at the right point in my life to have a child. And that's what hurt the most. I want to be a mother, and I know I'm going to be a great mother.
And as the Bible tells us, each person is wonderfully made.
Eliminate rape. That is the Texas Republican plan to make sure that no victim of rape in Texas will ever need abortion. Eliminate rape.
Nearly every top Democrat in Congress now supports taxpayer-funded abortion all the way up until the moment of birth.
Would that woman who decided to have an abortion, which would be considered an illegal abortion, be charged with murder?
Okay, let's go back to the basic question there. Is that a human being? Is that a little boy or girl? If it is, it deserves equal protection under the law.
So you're saying yes?
Yes, I am.
Last year, lawmakers in New York cheered with delight upon the passage of legislation that would allow a baby to be ripped from the mother's womb right up until delivery.
We have since 1973 been in the process of slaughtering the unborn at the rate of 1.5 million per year.
We have never once had a single opponent of abortion ever tell the truth when asked why should victims of rape and incest be forced to give birth.
Put out my White Lives Matter tee. The White Lives Matter tee don't say nothing. It don't say DEFCON or nothing on it, right? I'm like, put it out. And he's telling me, like, yo, I want you to visit the Holocaust Museum. And I was like, yo, I want you to visit Planned Parenthood. That's our Holocaust Museum.
And we have, as a result, the blood on our hands of 13 million innocent, voiceless, defenseless, unborn babies who have no voice except those of us who will stand up and face the noisemakers like this speaking out for them.
Excuse me? Wow, okay, Colin Jost thinks women are clowns. Cool. Let me do some helium. Okay, Colin, here's my truth.
I I know I wouldn't be a clown on TV here today if it weren't for the abortion I had the day before my 23rd birthday. Clowns have been helping each other end their pregnancy since the caves. It's gonna happen, so it ought to be safe, legal, and accessible. We will not go back to the alley. I mean, the last thing anyone wants is a bunch of dead clowns in a dark alley.
Goober the clown, everyone.
Yeah, better disable comments on this one.
Roe v. Wade, the 1973 Supreme Court ruling that said the Constitution of these United States conferred the right to have an abortion, was overturned this past summer, June 24th, 2022, returning the issue of abortion back to the states, meaning that no, in fact, the Constitution did not guarantee the right to abortion. 6 out of 9 of our Supreme Court justices based this ruling on a very simple and lazy interpretation of the Constitution. The Constitution doesn't mention abortion, therefore, it isn't protected. Boom. Done. 77 years of Supreme Court experience for those who voted to overrule it, and their very experienced and very convincing argument was, should have gotten it in writing. Okay, let's go back a minute because I'm being unfair. It's not just that abortion isn't in the Constitution, according to the conservative justices, but rather it was a jumble of events in the 19th century and all the way back to the 15th century that made abortion illegal. The timeline is hard to parse because, in spite of all their fancy learnings, the majority opinion reads kind of funny. Quote, until the latter part of the 20th century, such a right was entirely unknown in American law, end quote, which is wrong. It's untrue. Not just untrue, but a flagrant lie and deliberate gaslighting. If you're going to understand pre-Roe abortion, you should at least have the intellectual curiosity to get up to speed on pre-Roe medical care. It is true that every state had laws against abortion at some stage, but the conservative justices don't tell you what stage, because abortion was considered illegal and immoral after quickening. That's a 19th century term, and earlier, used to determine the viability of a fetus. It's around 16 to 20 weeks, or when the fetus starts to move. But sure, okay, it isn't in the Constitution, and in the 19th century it was illegal, except it wasn't specifically outlawed until the second half of the 19th century. Roe v. Wade was overturned with a remarkably poor understanding of both history and women's health, and to really needle in this point, it was based on biased historic opinions of women's health. The American Medical Association of the 19th century was a group of elite white male doctors who both wanted an elevated status in American life, hence the association for a, to date, lowly profession, and who held a grudge against midwives. When they took up the topic of abortion, they encouraged states to make it illegal unless it was, quote, therapeutic. In other words, it was legal if a doctor performed an abortion and illegal if anyone else did it. They wanted a monopoly on abortion. It was also illegal to disseminate information on birth control well into the 20th century unless you were a doctor. But don't take my word for it. I'm neither a doctor nor a justice. Take it from the dissenting justices Breyer, Kagan, and Sotomayor. Quote, the right Roe and Casey recognized does not stand alone. To the contrary, the court has linked it for decades to other settled freedoms involving bodily integrity, familial relationships, and procreation. Most obviously, the right to terminate a pregnancy arose straight out of the right to purchase and use contraception. In turn, those rights led more recently to rights of same-sex intimacy and marriage. Either the mass of the majority's opinion is hypocrisy, or additional constitutional rights are under threat. It is one or the other. End quote. Either the mass of the majority's opinion is hypocrisy, or additional constitutional rights are under threat. Wow. In America, the land of plenty, we can actually have it both ways. The majority opinion is both hypocritical and it threatens additional constitutional rights. When Roe was overturned in June, the public was outraged. Established precedent, bodily autonomy, the freedom of women to determine the fate of their own bodies and lives, all upturned and sent out the window. But those who are anti-choice, they rejoiced. And I am really sorry to do this to you, but we have to shine a light on the forced birth movement. So, fair warning, it's about to get icky. So, philosophically, if we're gracious enough to grant them a philosophy, the anti-abortion movement believes that abortion is murder. Full stop. Not hypothetically murder, not technically murder, not similar to murder. Abortion is the full-on dead nuts murder of babies. Babies. Tiny, chubby humans that coo and make funny faces and bring us all joy. An abortion is the murder of those sweet cooing babies. Not just murder, but torture and dismemberment. Now, the idea of actual infants being abused and murdered is grotesque. It's horrifying. It is a sickening thing to think about, but that is the anti-abortion trick. Babies are cute. Embryos are not. Anti-abortion activists say they believe life begins at conception, but this is not how they approach abortion. Forced birthers instead begin with a full-term baby, as in the fetus post-birth. It's an important starting point because really, truly, a baby that is 10 seconds old is the very exact same thing as the fetus just 10 seconds before birth. It hasn't changed. And anti-abortion activists want you to keep that association in your head as long as possible while they work their way backwards from birth to conception. Working backwards, a newborn looks just like a fetus at 9 months, which looks like a larger version of the fetus at 8 months, which is a more defined version of the fetus at 7 months, and as long as you're using the older fetus as a reference, you're mentally making the connection to the fully formed and birthed newborn, all the way down to, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 month, and also conception. It's all the same thing. This isn't my hypothesis. It's their actual fucking playbook. The anti-abortion movement of today has changed little, if at all, from its start in the 1970s, thanks in large part to the work of Jack and Barbara Wilkie, Catholic sex educators who released the 140-page Handbook on Abortion in 1971. Catholic sex educators is a misnomer. They taught abstinence-only sex education and answered a lot of questions about abortion and sex to the point that their daughter encouraged them to write the book. The 1971 book sells out in the first year. It's a big hit. But it's a book and they need something easier to hand out, so they make these little brochures titled Life or Death with a handy question and answer section and a bunch of graphic photos. Like, don't get me wrong, they are indeed graphic and they are meant to elicit an emotional response. One photo is of collected fetuses at 18 to 24 weeks. It's titled Human Garbage with the caption, quote, "This is the result of one morning's work at a Canadian teaching hospital," end quote. And those fetuses in that picture, they sure as hell, well, there's arms, legs, torsos, heads, all perfectly identifiable as human fetuses. The images are graphic and the language is charged, quote, "These dead babies were killed by abortion," end quote. This image is juxtaposed with a baby born prematurely being kept alive in an incubator at 21 weeks. The 1971 book and the 1972 brochure really go together. They blend seamlessly. The book is just as graphic as the brochure and just as emotionally charged. And the playbook works remarkably well. Images of living babies and dead fetuses side by side, both the same gestational age. Iconic photos like tiny feet, quote, "Tiny human feet at 10 weeks, perfectly formed," end quote. They are pinched between a thumb and forefinger, half the length of a fingernail. And then the image teardrop, which is a 6-week-old fetus dangling in a tiny amniotic sac. Quote, "This tiny human was yet alive at this moment, a just removed tubal pregnancy," end quote. The Wilkies are important, but I can't give you the full story here. I encourage you to check out Slate's Slow Burn podcast, Season 7, Episode 2, Life or Death. The charged language used by the Wilkies hasn't changed a bit after 50 years. In fact, there has been no need to change the language because it is so effective. Tied with the reverse timeline of a fetus's development, anti-abortion advocates have a much easier time spreading their message. It is uniform and lacks nuance. It provides for little to no interpretation or exception. You don't have to be smart, educated, or critical to be against murdering babies. It's all right there in the 1971 Codichromes. A fetus is not born, a baby is born. And before the baby is born, it was a baby in a uterus. Perhaps just as ingenious as the working backwards approach of examining fetal development is the deliberate use of language in anti-abortion literature. The word fetus is discarded in favor of the word baby, and depending on the literature, gendered pronouns are used. A baby at 7 weeks, she has nostrils. From the Wilkies Handbook on Abortion, even the fertilized ovum is a person. Quote, "Did you come from a fertilized ovum? No. You were once a fertilized ovum who grew and developed into the child or adult you are today. Nothing has been added to the fertilized ovum who you once were except nutrition," end quote. This connection is vital to the anti-abortion movement. It is codified later in the handbook with the words, quote, human death is merely the end of human life, end quote. If the fertilized ovum is a whom, its intentional termination is not only death, but murder. And that is the anti-abortion stance in a nutshell. These are powerful statements, and you know what? They are coherent thoughts, and I'll give them. They are sound justification for the anti-abortion movement. Without their conceptualization, we have no chance of communicating, let alone defending, a pro-choice viewpoint. Having said all of that, Unfuck the Poor politely disagrees. And let me get personal for just a minute. I don't possess a uterus, and I will never carry a fetus inside me. I have no idea what the emotional toll of abortion feels like. I have no idea how I would make this decision. My opinion comes exclusively from the fact that I don't have to make this choice ever. For women who do face this choice, they should have all options available to them from which to choose, and that includes abortion. That, to my understanding, is the entire meaning of my body, my choice. Further, the decision to have an abortion is the exclusive realm of the woman and her healthcare provider, no one else's. Outside of that, I make no judgment on anyone for whatever they do with their bodies. I do, however, make serious judgments against those who wish to restrict their right to choose. And in that regard, I'm kind of an asshole. I disagree with the Wilkies that a fertilized ovum is a whom. I agree that in human beings, a fertilized ovum is a fertilized human ovum, and I disagree with the Wilkies that a fetus at 8 weeks is a baby. From conception to birth, a fetus is a human in development. It is not whole. The possibility of needing an abortion in the 3rd trimester exists, and therefore this option must remain available. As long as the possibility of complication in pregnancy exists, so too should its safe and effective treatment at any stage. An interesting thing has happened in the news since Roe was overturned, and that is the prevalence of reporting on all those exceptions to the abortion ban that conservatives say are so rare. It is the existence of those exceptions that necessitates the need for choice throughout pregnancy, and it is the severe emotional toll on the individual that necessitates an ironclad right to privacy when it comes to abortion. That is, the emotional toll for both the women who choose to have an abortion and everyone else who thinks abortion is a moral wrong. There is no reason for an anti-abortion advocate to know what a woman is doing with her body. Remember that anti-abortion advocates approach their view from a position of emotional investment. The use of the word baby, the use of the words he and she, the use of graphic images of partially developed fetuses with identifiably human features, and the core belief that the intentional termination of a fetus meets their definition of human death and therefore murder. Because of the emotional investment of anti-abortion advocates and their established notion of morality, journalists have done a very savvy thing by sourcing abortion stories that pierce this black and white view. Notably, stories of anti-abortion women who find themselves in need of abortion care. Mind you, this is not gotcha journalism. The women in these stories have lost a lot, from couples who desperately wanted children to women who lose friends and family over having to make this choice. Their stories add nuance and introspection to an overheated topic. Further, the fact that these women give up their privacy to share these stories hits hard when you consider that they shouldn't have to justify to the world why they had to make the hardest choice of their lives and the hurdles they had to overcome simply to receive the care they needed. Planned Parenthood says it best. There are no bad reasons to get an abortion. And women on Twitter have embraced #whatever-the-reason to both show their pro-choice support and share their stories. At Lindsay Eyre, quote, "I didn't have the mental or financial capacity a child deserves. It was the most traumatic and heart-wrenching experience of my life, but 2 souls, and who knows how many more, were spared, even more pain, trauma, and loss because of it." End quote. At HippieVibes777, quote, "I found myself in a relation with a mentally ill man who tried to kill me and my 4-year-old son. The stress and trauma caused issues with my pregnancy. I had a choice to make, abort or leave my 3 children motherless. My choice was easy." End quote. At Your Girl Adri, quote, "I fight for abortion access because my sister's abuser got her pregnant on purpose." End quote. At Danielle Joy 8, quote, "I'm alive today because in 2012, a medical professional had the ability to perform the procedure that saved my life." End quote. At POSC Girl, quote, I was raped by my then partner, who had come back from Afghanistan. He was abusive. I had 3 kiddos who needed me. I would have died to be unpregnant. Abortion saved my life, and it saved my kids too. We escaped. At Journey of Livin', quote, my friend was raped by an adult male family friend at 13 and got pregnant. She was tiny and would have died if she had been forced to go through with the pregnancy. End quote. When access to abortion is restricted, when we set exceptions to it, like rape, incest, for the health of the mother, we aren't making the moral concession we think we are. We are prioritizing one trauma over another, and there is no hierarchy of trauma. A woman who is psychologically and financially incapable of caring for a child experiences pregnancy as a unique trauma, but no more or less worthy of compassionate care than victims of abuse or those whose health is in danger. The exceptions and compromises that moderates wish to carve out for abortion access, whether setting restrictions on time or circumstance, nonetheless require women to be the subject of scrutiny. Is abortion allowed or justified in their case? When the answer is no to some but yes to others, the freedom of choice is not real. The hardline anti-abortion stance, abortion is murder, is not a statement about children, but about women themselves. It is only an insult. The implication is that the woman is a murderer, the doctor is a murderer. It is not a profound expression of implicit humanity and undeniable morality. It is meant to demean and discredit. It serves double duty as a slogan for oppression. When it makes its way to the political realm, when the black and white roles of murderer and protector are invoked in legislation and enforced by law, it makes women and doctors criminals. It threatens the right to self-determination and autonomy with state violence. But the state controls no womb. The arguments against abortion are intellectually lazy at their best and deceptive and misleading at their worst. In the Wilkie's Landmark Handbook, the concern about the life of the child is framed narrowly in a Christian context. Of their many solutions for combating abortion in the United States, they always come back to a tried and true method for solving complex social issues: prayer. From 1985's Abortion Question and Answers, quote, pray as if everything depends on your prayers, for it just might be so. Pray that God will stay his hand. Will we as a nation deserve his help and his mercy? End quote. As long as religious conviction and moral superiority are the basis for the anti-abortion movement, our fight is not for abortion, but rather against religion. That is an entirely different episode, but the context is important. As a society, we are fighting 2 completely separate battles. We are having 2 distinct conversations. We are occupying 2 realities. Anti-abortion activists have had nearly half a century to form organizations, influence political parties, and legitimize their oppressive beliefs. Their playbook is tried and true, but it hasn't kept up with the times. Graphic images of aborted fetuses represent the horror they believe abortion to be, but they are no longer the reality of abortion care. In the U.S. and around the world, abortion has become safer and less gruesome. Ironic, then, that when strict anti-abortion laws are passed, it's women who face a cruel and gruesome fate. In the United States, perhaps the most interesting story about abortion is that since the 1973 Roe v. Wade ruling, the number of abortions per year initially rose, starting at 16.3 abortions per 1,000 women and reaching its peak in 1980 at 29.3 abortions per 1,000 women. But since then, the number of annual abortions has fallen drastically. By 2017, abortions per 1,000 women had fallen to an all-time low of just 13.5. Those are the numbers just for the United States. Around the globe, better access to contraceptives has reduced the need for abortions over the last 25 years. The Guttmacher Institute, whose entire jam is reproductive health and where I get a lot of these lovely statistics, cites improved access to birth control as a major player in preventing pregnancy in the first place and reducing the need for abortions overall. What hasn't helped? Stricter abortion laws. Around the world, the rate of abortion in countries with strict abortion laws are higher than in those with relaxed laws. 34 per 1,000 women in countries with broad abortion access, and 37 per 1,000 in countries with restricted access. Strict abortion laws have statistically higher rates of abortion, not lower. So what do those strict abortion laws get you? Unsafe abortions. Defined by the World Health Organization as a, quote, procedure for terminating an unintended pregnancy carried out either by persons lacking the necessary skills or in an environment that does not conform to minimal medical standards, or both, end quote. Women who intend to end their pregnancy will do so with or without a medical professional, and criminalizing abortion means that doctors are prohibited from providing basic care that can save lives. Contrary to the anti-abortion narrative, most abortions, 88%, take place within the first 12 weeks of pregnancy. Further, 10.6% still occur before the age of viability, 21 weeks, while the CDC cites only 1.4% of abortions occur after 21 weeks. Those 1.4% of abortions occurring after 21 weeks exist in the anti-abortion hotspot known as the late-term abortion. This phrase is used, yet again, to elicit an emotional response from those who hear it. It's easy to remember, and it's easy to spout off like you think you know something, but you don't know something. Late-term abortion is not real. It's not a thing. At least, it's not a medical thing. It is not a medical term, and it doesn't even refer to a specific gestational age. However, the phrase, as tossed around in the media and by politicians, is intentionally non-specific. It's used generally to refer to abortions that occur after 21 weeks, but I challenge you, did you think 21 weeks when you heard late-term abortion? That's probably not the first thing you think of, so let's be clear about that vague language. Late term is specifically meant to evoke an image of a woman just about to give birth who decides, perhaps on a whim, perhaps as a last-minute moment of truth, change of heart, that she has changed her mind about having a baby. Psychopaths who play the role of politicians love to use this term. They love making people think that abortion advocates want to murder babies as soon as it's on the way out of the birth canal. Unsatisfied with merely implying such a scenario, Donald Trump, during the third presidential debate of 2016, painted the world a picture, claiming, quote, "If you go with what Hillary is saying, in the 9th month, you can take the baby and rip the baby out of the womb of the mother just prior to the birth of the baby," end quote. Now, I don't know if you're ready to hear this, but here it goes. That doesn't happen. As in, it is not something that a woman who doesn't want a baby will do. She doesn't do it, it doesn't happen. This instance is so rare that Dr. Jen Gunter, an OBGYN with 15 years of experience performing late-term abortions, had never done one. She in fact said on her blog, quote, "A 9th-month abortion is a unicorn, and so it's ridiculous to even discuss it. Terminations after 24 weeks are for severe fetal anomalies," end quote. We agree. It's ridiculous to dignify such a statement as Donald Trump's with a response. It's ridiculous to discuss, but there's actually something serious and relevant there. Maybe you have alarm bells going off in your head, thinking about that phrase we said just a few minutes ago, health of the mother. That's what's serious here. In the case of Allison Draper, a 40-year-old Mormon woman whose heartbreaking Facebook post in response to Trump's abortion statement went viral, started off like this, quote, "I had a late-term abortion. It is nothing like described by Trump. Please don't base your vote on the fear-mongering. Please read my experience," end quote. Draper was late in her pregnancy with twins when one of them died. The other had spina bifida so severe, quote, that his brain had developed outside his head and his spine was open clear to the lumbar level. There was zero hope and no medical miracle that could save him, end quote. Perhaps one of the most wanted and most planned pregnancies on record, Draper, then 40 years old, already had 6 children and still wanted more. The twins were from in vitro fertilization. Her age, the abortion, and the trauma it caused meant no more pregnancies. Draper's health was at risk due to the dead fetus, and the other wasn't viable. The only option for Draper's health, and for the sake of her 6 children, was to have an abortion, in spite of it being the very last thing she wanted. The reasons for abortions after 21 weeks are squarely in the realm of the mother's health or severe fetal defects: heart failure, lupus, uterine infection, encephalopathy, spina bifida, and fetal death. In even rarer cases, pregnant women diagnosed with cancer may face the very real complication of accelerated cancer growth because of ramped-up hormones due to pregnancy. For example, rapid breast cancer growth due to high levels of estrogen. This requires urgent treatment. You can't just wait 6 months, give birth, and then start your cancer treatment. And oncology drugs are toxic to developing fetuses, and cancer will kill you. In order to receive treatment, it is safer and more humane to terminate the pregnancy. But These cases haven't even reached the unicorn levels of the 9th month abortion. The 9th month is actually a bit longer, starting somewhere around 33 to 36 weeks up to 40 weeks birth. This particularly vile instance of elective abortion simply doesn't exist. At least not that I can find. Sure, of course, we can all use Google, but even with access to a medical university's online library and peer-reviewed collection of literature, I could find not a single case study of elective 9th month abortion, infanticide, or neonaticide. Not a single peer-reviewed article, not a single news article, nothing. Remarkably, humans simply don't do this. And in the extremely rare case of the medically necessary unicorn, it is so far-fetched that it remains a fantasy of the anti-abortion movement. It simply doesn't exist. It is bullshit from the start. Find me one fucking example. And because it doesn't exist, and because I wasted hours researching it, it is a red herring, a thing that is intentionally distracting or misleading. It is a subject that is meant to be indefensible, because facts about actual abortion cases are really hard to vilify. So let's rewind. 98.6% of abortions occur before 21 weeks. So, who are the monsters getting abortions after 21 weeks? Girls, aged 15 and under. Girls 15 and under obtain abortions later in pregnancy than any other demographic, and the reasons, well, weren't you ever a teenager? Patients cited fear of parents' reactions, denial that they were really pregnant, delays caused by states requiring parental consent, or lengthy court processes to bypass parental consent for minors, and later detection of pregnancy overall, about 1 week later on average. We owe serious attention to the misunderstood topic of teenage pregnancy and the federal funding program established to help prevent unwanted pregnancy, among other healthcare services, known simply as Title X. Title X was established in 1970, 3 years before the original Roe v. Wade ruling, and its purpose is just as simple as its colloquial name: provide affordable birth control and reproductive health care to poor people. Regardless of background, income, where they live, whether or not they have insurance, Title X helped millions of families access basic primary and preventive reproductive health care services. Wellness exams, cervical and breast cancer screenings, birth control, contraception education, and testing for STDs and HIV. But not, and this is really fucking important, not abortions. From the outset in 1970, Title X funds have not ever been available for abortion care. Never, ever has federal funding from Title X been used for abortions, because it has never been allowed under federal law. But you might be saying, but Planned Parenthood receives Title X funding and they perform abortions. Yeah, no shit, indeed they do. In July 2000, the Federal Register published guidance on how Title X services must be, quote, separate and distinct from non-Title X services if they are provided in the same facility. So how do you do that when patients for Title X and non-Title X services share the same waiting room, staff, and record system? Title X services can provide information and non-directive counseling on prenatal care and delivery, infant care, foster care, adoption, and abortion. Under Title X rules, a service provider cannot guide a patient towards adoption or foster care any more than they can recommend abortion. In fact, the Title X provider cannot assist in negotiating abortion costs, making appointments, or even securing abortion services. They can, however, provide any and all referrals to any and all services that are available to their patients at their patient's request. Ask any bookkeeper, and they'll tell you it's simple. Separating Title X funds from non-Title X activities is a matter of allocating resources and prorating costs. That is, patients still have to pay for abortion care because Title X doesn't cover it, and any facility that uses Title X funds for abortion care will lose its funding. Their bookkeeping and remittance practices must follow Title X guidelines. 9% of Title X clients are aged 17 and younger, and 29% are aged 18 to 24. Together, they make up the largest group of recipients of Title X services, and 66% of all Title X clients had incomes at or below the federal poverty line. And just a reminder, the poverty line for individuals is $13,590 per year. 60% of clients who relied on Title X for contraception also used their Title X clinic for broader reproductive health care services. These are huge fucking numbers. And if you were an asshole, you might think to yourself, how can I fuck over all these poor people? By 2016, 4 million Americans relied on the affordable services at their local Title X clinics, 41% of whom relied on Planned Parenthood specifically and exclusively. You know, the organization that can't use federal funds for abortion care. Well, in 2019, one-term President Donald Trump implemented the Title X gag rule, banning doctors at Title X clinics from providing information about abortion and making referrals. That, you know what, in and of itself might be manageable. Maybe you can provide abortion care at the same clinic, but you can't make referrals or give information. It's the kind of Faustian bargain in which the belief in holistic approaches to medicine are abandoned in order to provide at least a new minimum level of care. That's dark and not what reproductive health is about. But that's also only half of the gag rule. The other half seems specifically targeted at Planned Parenthood, which, again, just a reminder, has never used Title X funds for abortion care. Trump's 2019 gag rule also imposed a physical separation requirement between the Title X part of a clinic and the non-Title X part. The Federal Register's guidelines from nearly 20 years earlier, which established separation of funds, took for granted the intended recipient of Title X funds, poor people. And remember that service at or below the federal poverty limit is free to the client. These clinics do not make a killing off of Title X funds or abortion. The extent to which Title X works as intended is remarkable. It is in fact a beautiful example of a government program working as designed. 68% of counties in the United States with a Planned Parenthood health center see half that county's population utilizing those services. Almost a third of women who need publicly funded health care, that is, who can't afford it on their own, live in counties where Planned Parenthood is the primary provider. Planned Parenthood, which receives Title X funding for providing comprehensive reproductive health care services for poor communities, but not abortions, was suddenly hit with the requirement that they either make drastic changes to the buildings they occupy in order to continue to provide abortion care, or build or lease an entirely separate facility. The physical separation of services cannot be overstated as a death blow to Planned Parenthood. Now, another personal note. My career field just happens to be healthcare construction. So here's a brief rundown on what the physical separation of Title X and non-Title X facilities entails. Let's start simple, separating an existing facility into two separate units. Simple, right? Well, separate units means the construction of a fire-rated assembly between the units, which is not a cheap retrofit. It means permits, Department of Health inspections, separate fire and sprinkler assemblies, separate HVAC and electrical services. It requires city or county wastewater surveys to make sure that the existing sewer can handle the additional occupancy. Tie all that up with engineering fees, architectural fees, contractor fees, and you're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars just to add a separate entrance and exit to make them two distinct properties. That also requires additional staff, like double the staff because you have now two independent facilities. Practically overnight, 41% of Title X patients were suddenly excluded from receiving safety net reproductive health care. 1.6 million people, most of them at or below the poverty line, have been left without affordable options. And wouldn't you know it, most of them are minorities. 65% of Title X patients identify as non-white. 33% Hispanic or Latino, 22% Black or African American, 4% Asian, 4% is more than one race, 1% American Indian or Alaska Native, and 1% Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander. The Title X gag rule did not save a single baby, but it did cut off poor minorities from receiving reproductive health care services. I'll say it again. 1/3 of women live in a community where Planned Parenthood is the sole primary reproductive health care provider. So no, these patients weren't just magically absorbed by other community resources, because for many communities, Planned Parenthood was the only resource. It's okay if you don't remember the Title X gag rule from the news. It occurred in the first half of 2019 in the run-up to a trajectory-altering, once-in-a-lifetime global catastrophe that overshadowed every single news story from the prior decade. The gag rule and COVID-19 forced a major change in reproductive health care, and specifically abortion. Instead of making abortions more difficult to obtain, they became easier and safer than ever before. In the first half of 2019, before the COVID-19 pandemic changed the course of modern history, the Guttmacher Institute published a paper by Guttmacher's own Megan Donovan, unassumingly titled Improving Access to Abortion via Telehealth. The statistics gathered by Guttmacher and cited by Donovan help us understand the explosion of life-changing telehealth care during the pandemic. A December 2018 survey estimated that there are 79 million Americans in rural and urban areas that were in federally designated health professional shortage areas, while a 2017 survey showed half of U.S. counties lacked an obstetrician-gynecologist. Way back in 2008, Planned Parenthood of the Heartland broke new ground with the use of telehealth visits for patients in Iowa. Patients were able to visit health centers that weren't staffed by abortion providers and get consultations with abortion providers at other clinics via the internet, helping to bridge the gaps in access for rural patients. By 2019, Planned Parenthood was offering this service in 10 states. After an in-person consultation and screening visit at the patient's primary health center, they were then connected with a provider by teleconference at another clinic who was able to review medical records, answer questions, and then remotely authorize abortion medication. And this method worked. It effectively served the needs of patients who lived more than 50 miles from the nearest clinic offering surgical abortion and increased patients' ability to obtain abortions in the first trimester. Qualitative surveys, the kind that ask you about your experience, indicated that providers and patients found telehealth abortions to be an overall positive experience, while evaluations proved the model safe and effective. Separate data from Alaska and Hawaiian Islands confirmed the findings from Iowa. Patients were given access to more choices, they were seen sooner and closer to home, it was a good experience, it was safe and effective. Under special approval from the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, Genuity Health Products began an even more revolutionary telehealth abortion model in 2016, a direct-to-patient model that eliminated the need for an in-person clinic visit. This allowed even greater access to patients who could sign into a teleconference from their own home and meet directly with an abortion provider who could remotely authorize medication to be delivered directly to the patient's home. Via the teleconference, the provider could also refer patients for ultrasounds and blood work. After receiving and taking the medication, the patient then followed up with local testing to ensure the pregnancy had been terminated. Not to be outmaneuvered, individual states put up roadblocks because, of course they did. 32 states require abortions to be performed by a licensed physician, hearkening back to the 19th century feud between the AMA and midwives. 19 states required abortions be performed in a hospital, and 17 states required a second physician after a specified point in pregnancy. These restrictions and roadblocks don't prevent abortion, and they don't even reflect the medical advancements of abortion care. Some of the laws, in fact, seem to prefer and enforce the gruesome abortions of the past that many abortion activists have stuck in their heads. Delayed access to care only ensures that the fetus will be more developed at the time of abortion, which means surgical abortion at 10 weeks and later. Abortions performed later in pregnancy are more dangerous for the woman. For reference, abortions within the 7th and 8th week of pregnancy have a mortality rate of 0.6 per 100,000 cases, whereas at 21 weeks, the rate is 20.5 per 100,000. COVID-19 jump-started the now commonplace telehealth visit for all of us. The rate of telehealth usage today is 38 times higher from a pre-COVID baseline, and the rate of telehealth abortions jumped too, from accounting for 37% of all abortions pre-COVID to 54% by 2020, further closing the gaps in patient access. Thanks to the robust federal funding of reproductive health care and advancements in medical and digital technologies, the United States has done a surprisingly good job reducing teenage pregnancies, lowering mortality rates, reducing abortions overall through access to contraceptives, and making abortions themselves safer, more effective, and easier to access. Introduced in the late 1980s, the medical abortion, which is the combination of two drugs, mifepristone and misoprostol, given in the first trimester of pregnancy, became a recommended safe method of abortion by the World Health Organization, and by the early 2000s, medication-induced abortion was added to the WHO's list of essential medicines. With the first dose, mifepristone, the lining of the uterus thins and prevents the embryo from staying implanted and growing. It does this by blocking progesterone, a sex hormone crucial to the menstrual cycle, embryogenesis, and pregnancy. The second dose, misoprostol, causes the uterus to contract and expel the embryo through the vagina. The efficacy of the mifemiso combination is not news. In France, the percentage of medication abortions has increased year after year, from 18% in 1996 to 49% by 2007. In 2009, 81.2% of early abortions in Scotland were medication-based, and by 2019, medical abortions accounted for 96.4% of first trimester abortions in Sweden. The medical and reproductive healthcare communities have worked diligently over the past half-century to reduce unwanted pregnancies and terminate unwanted pregnancies closer and closer to the date of conception. Take just a moment to digest the reality of the abortion debate. Real-life abortions are happening earlier in pregnancy, and they are safer and are more easily accessible by the women who have the fewest options. Anti-abortion activists prefer to ignore this reality and distract with the myth of the 9th-month abortion, images of mutilated second and third trimester fetuses, and the portrayal of both woman and doctor as heartless murderers. Their beliefs do not reflect reality. Consider that all of the advances of abortion care in the U.S. came in spite of nearly half a century of lobbying and legislating state by state to restrict access to funding, create unnecessary bureaucratic hurdles, place arbitrary restrictions on gestational age, and churn up archaic talking points to manipulate public emotion and opinion. But public opinion has not been swayed. In opposition, 61% of U.S. adults say abortion should be legal in all or most cases, while only 37% believe it should be illegal in all or most cases. So what the fuck happened? It's important to understand that Roe v. Wade was the foundation for numerous successive Supreme Court cases. Roe established the right to abortion as a matter of privacy as a constitutional right implied by the 14th Amendment. Maybe you've heard of it. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Roe's power comes in the interpretation of due process, with the original Roe ruling stating, quote, "The petitioners are entitled to respect for their private lives. The state cannot demean their existence or control their destiny by making their private sexual conduct a crime." End quote. The precedent set by Roe paved the way for the most consequential reproductive health rulings of the 20th and 21st centuries. Carey v. Population Services International allowed contraceptive manufacturers to distribute and sell their products to teenagers. Ayotte v. Planned Parenthood struck down a parental notification law. Whole Woman's Health versus Hellerstedt ruled that Texas's requirement for abortion providers to have admitting privileges within 30 miles of where an abortion was performed was unconstitutional. But it was the Supreme Court's decision in favor of anti-abortion measures that got us to the point of overturning it. Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization, the case that got Roe overturned, was a deliberate effort to bring an obviously unconstitutional law before the Supreme Court, which was, by 2022, ultra-conservative thanks to the addition of Brett Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett. Mississippi's 15-week abortion ban was simply a cover. The reason for overturning the ruling, you'll remember, was that the Constitution does not explicitly provide a right to abortion. The only way to understand the Dobbs case is in consideration of the full story of abortion care since the 1973 Roe ruling. In spite of earlier, safer, and more accessible abortion care today, the Supreme Court has no interest in upholding a ruling that it disagrees with ideologically. That's it. 6 conservative justices, whose flimsy ruling relies on 19th century state law and a very literal reading of the Constitution, ruled according to their personal beliefs and not reality. Ignoring popular approval and legal precedent, the new Supreme Court established its position as an extension of modern politics, specifically a far-right Supreme Court that relies on belief rather than law. It has nothing to do with health, not women's health, not children's health, and not the health of the nation. But it wasn't always this way. It was a conservative majority court under Nixon that Roe v. Wade was initially decided. And in 1971 and 1974, the Southern Baptist Convention passed resolutions supporting the liberalization of abortion law. Quote, "Religious liberty, human equality, and justice are advanced by the Supreme Court abortion decision." End quote. Barry Goldwater, known for his arguably racist Southern strategy for the Nixon campaign, was also a proponent of the Supreme Court ruling, and his wife Peggy was a co-founder of Planned Parenthood in Arizona. Praised by the church and New Age, horrible conservatives of the past, as well as feminists and liberals and civil rights advocates, Roe v. Wade was, for its time, a unifying decision across the left-right divide. America was in favor. You do not have to be a diligent scholar of contemporary politics to understand that the anti-abortion beliefs of today are religiously based. You cannot listen to any right-wing politician, watch any conservative rally or conference, or read any conservative op-ed without encountering the religious justification for nearly every policy. There is a reason that conservatives rail against critical race theory and wokeism, other than just distracting us. If you dissect the history of the modern Republican platform, you will only encounter racism and bigotry. They don't want you learning about their history because you will find that it's based on hate. And they don't want social or ethnic minorities to be equal because their hateful policies are designed specifically to marginalize and oppress. But I'm not just making generalizations. This isn't my opinion. For nearly 100 years, there has been a proposed amendment to the U.S. Constitution that has yet to be ratified. The Equal Rights Amendment, meant to guarantee equal legal rights for all American citizens, regardless of sex. The first version was written and proposed in 1923 by feminist socialist suffragettes Alice Paul and Crystal Eastman. Over the last century, the amendment has resurfaced from decade to decade, stirring up the womenfolk and allies who must be asking themselves, what the fuck is wrong with this country? Because honestly, Equal Rights Amendment? We have to add this to the fucking Constitution? Seriously? We have to specify this? The most vocal and ardent opposition to the ERA came surprisingly from one woman in the 1970s, Phyllis Schlafly, who thought the notion of equal rights for women was absurd because men and women were fundamentally different. Women had babies and men did not. Therefore, they could not be equals. Go swim in that for a moment. Schlafly, a Catholic, framed her entire politics from her faith. She was an attorney, conservative activist, and anti-feminist spokesperson. She was involved in government work and politics from the very start of her career, and she ran for Congress as Republican in 1952. She lost. Her presence in the party and her particular beliefs in the legal separation of the sexes gave her an immense platform for decades. Schlafly's politics, guided by her faith, made absolutely no fucking sense unless you just wanted someone to put words to your prejudices. Women's rights, according to Schlafly, were enshrined in the inherent inequality of the sexes. Their right to have babies and to be protected were achieved through family structure and the vague conservative notion of men being natural gentlemen and protectors if allowed to thrive. Schlafly's words, quote, "Most women would rather cuddle a baby than a typewriter or a factory machine," end quote. Schlafly was not a secret Christian. She monetized and politicized her faith for the conservative machine. Her 1981 book, The Power of the Christian Woman, argued that women's freedom came specifically from not having the government involved in matters of their rights. And that included Roe, which she called, quote, the worst decision in the history of the U.S. Supreme Court, adding that Roe, quote, is responsible for the killing of millions of unborn babies, end quote. Schlafly even had a specific remedy for pro-life college women, urging them to, quote, bring pro-life and anti-feminist speakers to campus, have an event on the anniversary of Roe v. Wade, and stay away from women's studies courses, end quote. Schlafly is but one woman in a red wave consisting of hundreds of influential public figures who sought to attack abortion rights. Even though she doesn't evoke the imagery or language of the Wilkie's abortion books and brochures, she, like the Wilkies, gave the modern right the talking points still used today, right down to demonizing feminists and dismissing women's studies. The conservative playbook is old and boring, but effective. The wave of Christian conservatives that came to power and influence in a post-Roe world is called, by some scholars, the New Right, which was led unsurprisingly by Schlafly herself, along with Howard Phillips, Paul Weyrich, Richard Viguerie, and Jerry Falwell, all of whom could have their own episodes, who themselves formed the Moral Majority, a political organization created specifically to train and mobilize and invigorate America's religious right. Their mission was successful if you look at today's political and social landscape. A minority of very religious devotees have infiltrated and now direct our nation's politics. This movement didn't actually start with abortion, but rather concern over tax exemptions for segregated Christian schools. Falwell and fellow conservative Southern pastors were financially involved with segregated schools and universities, and Bob Jones Sr., evangelist and founder of Bob Jones University, called segregation, quote, God's established order, and referred to desegregationists as, quote, satanic propagandists. Schlafly herself acknowledged that shifting the Republican Party from pro-abortion to anti-abortion was an arduous proposition, initially meant to unify conservative Catholics and conservative Protestants and evangelicals who had differing views on the topic. But by wrapping abortion up in their agreed-upon critiques of the modern world, sexual revolution, civil rights, women's liberation, abortion came to be perceived as a symptom of a failing and wayward social structure. But ideology does not organically propagate. It needs some kind of accelerant, and nothing works better than money. Billions of dollars over the past 5 decades have been invested in building, maintaining, and releasing the momentum of Christian conservatives overtaking our federal courts. From policy groups, think tanks, networking, and media initiatives, and organizations such as First Liberty, Beckett, and the Federalist Society all operate as part of this vital infrastructure to build coalition, spread belief, and gain following, and capture courts to change the fundamental way our nation works. One such legal advocacy group, the Alliance Defending Freedom, is explicitly anti-LGBT. They want to expand Christian practices in public schools and government and prevent access to abortion and contraceptives. 90% of Trump's appellate court nominees were or are Federalist Society members, as are all 6 conservative Supreme Court justices. The Federalist Society is one of those wink-wink, nudge-nudge organizations boasting 60,000 members consisting of lawyers, law students, and scholars. The society makes the bold claim that their sole mission is to, quote, sponsor fair, serious, and open debate about the need to enhance individual freedom and the role of the courts in saying what the law is rather than what they wish it to be. End quote. They explicitly state that the society is about ideas and that they don't lobby for legislation, take policy positions, or sponsor candidates for public office. That's all well and good, but their ideas, which are totally not a mandate for all members, nonetheless lean toward Christian conservatism. Every op-ed is presented with the disclaimer, quote, the Federalist Society takes no positions on particular legal and public policy matters. But there is a theme. In a 2015 article, Religion and the Republic, the question of whether our republic is a religious one is legally affirmed. Quote, the very nature of a Republican limited government, therefore, is grounded in the acknowledgement of the presence of another, higher sovereign to whom individuals owe their loyalty. End quote. This is the basis of the further condemnation of discrimination for the sake of religious belief. Catholic Charities of Massachusetts should be able to discriminate against gay couples who wish to adopt through their organization. The conclusion, quote, without an affirmation of God, the very notion of a republic is disintegrating before our very eyes. End quote. The Federalist Society, at least in the opinions it publishes, is solidly in favor of eradicating the separation of church and state. They have a whole religious liberty section on their website that praises every instance of religious overstep and condemns every instance of upholding the Establishment Clause. You know, the whole First Amendment thing about not establishing a state religion. They conflate secularism with religious belief, an intentionally false misrepresentation concocted to justify their anti-First Amendment position. Far from being a society of ideas and not action, Leonard Leo, the society's former executive vice president, personally drafted lists of acceptable nominees for Trump Supreme Court picks and strategized with Trump and George W. Bush on getting their nominees confirmed. Leo recently made headlines for a $1.6 billion donation received from a 90-year-old conservative Chicago businessman. Accepting the donation through a tax-exempt 501c4 social welfare trust called the Marble Freedom Trust, Leo avoided a $400 million tax bill thanks in large part to Republicans successfully hindering the IRS's ability to tax such social welfare organizations. These billions of dollars in donations are distributed among a broad conservative network that funds conservative election campaigns, pushes judicial appointments, and takes on policy battles. In a 2020 interview with Axios, Leo himself was transparent about how all those donations would be used. Quote, to funnel tens of millions of dollars into conservative fights around the country. End quote. And one of those conservative fights, the one most important to Leo, is putting an end to abortion. A conservative Catholic, Leo's imprint is solidly on the Federalist Society's website, dominated by stories of legal slights to the Catholic Church. Conservative legal activist Ed Whelan wrote of Leo, quote, "No one has been more dedicated to the enterprise of building a Supreme Court that will overturn Roe v. Wade than the Federalist Society's Leonard Leo," end quote. And at a 2017 talk at the Action Institute, Leo said, quote, "I would love to see the courts unrecognizable," and noted that Trump was just the man to exploit to make it so. Obscene wealth and religious obsession have gone from the simpler days of simply establishing explicitly Christian values into daily life, such as adding under God to the Pledge of Allegiance, adding in God we trust to our currency, to the national prayer breakfast and Billy Graham's frequent trips to the White House. It has now become the seizure of legislative and judicial power that pushes the irrelevant beliefs of a religious minority onto the public at large. Overturning Roe v. Wade is as monumental as its original ruling, but it is not the end game of the newly emerged ruling class. Roe was just the start. The dissenting opinion on Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health rings even clearer. Either the mass of the majority's opinion is hypocrisy, or additional constitutional rights are under threat. With those in power, there can never be either or. It is both and all at once. The court now rules according not to established law, but personal conviction. It's a scary place to be. So how the fuck do you fight back? Let's get back to Roe, which until recently was a bipartisan issue. For now, states set their own agendas on abortion legislation, and local leaders don't have nearly as much money or support as national figures. You can tie up parties and local governments with publicly funded lawsuits, you can vote the fuckers out at the local level, and do the whole bootstrapping thing to raise money for non-asshole candidates. Knock on doors, help people register to vote. Don't be intimidated by poll watchers with assault rifles. God damn, that is our reality. And challenge bullshit where you hear it, engage in uncomfortable conversations, and don't let anyone think that overturning Roe has settled the issue. All of those things are exhausting, but remember that this is exactly what conservatives have been doing for decades, and they mean to make the fight exhausting. But that's not news to you, is it? That isn't particularly helpful. While conservatives played the long game, we now have a pretty fucking brutal reality ahead of us. So let's remember that the real-world implication of the weaponized judiciary is that poor women, women of color, and all women in general are affected now. So let's help. Become an abortion advocate and an abortion aide. Use the network you have to reach other women. Make your name and goal known. Help women get the care they need. Go to abortionfinder.org to help people find abortion providers closest to the women who need them. Abortionfunds.org is the website of the National Network of Abortion Funds, which connects women to organizations that support your financial and logistical needs in obtaining abortions. There are multiple abortion funds established in every state. The abortionfunds.org website is easy to navigate and provides step-by-step instructions on how to receive care. Abortion funds have more power than Leonard Leo. They are a network of more than 90 grassroots organizations that help people get abortions. They work locally, regionally, nationally, and internationally. Abortion funds help provide transportation, childcare funds, lodging, translation services, abortion doulas, and practically anything and everything else to support those in need. Don't just support them, but join them. Get updates on local events and fundraisers, and provide your resources to help. Visit keepourclinics.org to make donations to independent abortion providers to help them continue providing safe abortion care. You can also visit PlannedParenthood.org to find out how to support your local Planned Parenthood chapter. Bans Off Our Bodies is a national abortion rights campaign led by abortion rights supporters. They plan protests and provide resources for individuals and businesses to get involved and have volunteer opportunities. An offshoot of Planned Parenthood, find out more at PlannedParenthoodAction.org. The landscape has not just been complicated for providers and patients. For those of us who want to help, legal problems may be coming our way as well. We must be careful in how we help. Phone records, email and social media communications, text messages, GPS data, credit card data, and search history can all be subpoenaed and become part of investigations and court proceedings in states where helping provide abortion access has been criminalized. Understand the laws in your state before you offer to give someone a ride out of state. utilize encrypted communication strategies with self-deleting features. Signal is what I use, along with Proton Mail for official Unfuck the Poor correspondence. There's nothing inherently illegal about buying a burner phone or using a Tor network or VPN or publicly available Wi-Fi to hide your IP address. There's nothing inherently suspicious about paying for things with cash. If all of this sounds overly paranoid, it's for good reason. The judicial system has been weaponized, and the thugs in charge have already begun pressing charges against people for helping women obtain abortions. This year, 2022, Nebraska mother Jessica Burgess and her daughter Celeste, now 18, are being charged with felony burying and reburying remains, inducing and performing an abortion without being a licensed physician, concealing a death from police, and lying to the police. Local investigators obtained a search warrant ordering Facebook's parent company, Meta, to turn over messages between the mother and her daughter. And in April of 2022, Texas's Rio Grande Valley Sheriff's Department arrested 26-year-old Lizelle Herrera for allegedly self-inducing an abortion the prior year and was then held on a $500,000 bond. If, when, how's Repro Legal Defense Fund put up the $500,000 for bond, and advocates then petitioned the district attorney to drop the charges. The charges were ultimately dropped, but the why of Herrera's arrest is unclear. Texas Criminal Homicide Statute Title V, Chapter 19 exempts pregnant women from criminal charges for intentionally and knowingly causing the death of an individual by self-induced abortion. The language is clear, but the arrest and detention and prosecutor's intent remain unresolved. Was it an overreach of power, an intentional misreading of the law? Did they not understand the law, or did they merely disregard it? And in 2019, Chelsea Becker's face was broadcast on California news stations, warning the public not to approach her if spotted, but to call the police. She was 25 at the time and described as, quote, troubled. Her alleged crime? A stillbirth at a California hospital. Becker had been 8 months pregnant but had not attempted an abortion. A struggling drug addict, Becker spent 16 months in a California jail awaiting trial before her case was dismissed. California did not have a law that allowed for this type of prosecution. There was no evidence that Becker's addiction played a role in the stillbirth. At the time of her stillbirth, Becker was homeless, sleeping in a motel stairwell. While in jail, she lost custody of her 2-year-old adopted son, and she had 2 other children who were already in the custody of a relative. Becker had 3 reproductive infections at the time of the stillbirth, and the pathologist who conducted the fetus's autopsy admitted he had not reviewed Becker's medical records before determining cause of death, which he ruled as acute methamphetamine toxicity. The interpretation of California law in this particular case was so aggressively broad that it looked to establish precedent for pressing murder charges against any woman who engaged in reckless behavior and loses her fetus, whether or not that behavior resulted in miscarriage. For what it's worth, 2 physicians testified on Becker's behalf that the belief that methamphetamine causes stillbirths is nothing more than medical misinformation. In a case of jumping to conclusions, Christine Taylor was arrested for falling down a set of stairs and having a miscarriage. In discussing her pregnancy at the hospital, she spoke to her doctor about having considered abortion or adoption. The conversation led to an assumption, which led to an arrest for feticide. Her case was also dismissed. In May of 2019, Marche Jones, then 28 and pregnant, was shot in the abdomen during an altercation with Ebony Jemison, then 23, who was not charged with murder because a grand jury said she acted in self-defense, citing Alabama's Stand Your Ground law. Jones did not have a weapon. A grand jury indicted Jones, but her case was also eventually dismissed. Police, deputies, and prosecutors will continue to push the limits of a pregnant woman's guilt, whether for intentional abortion or miscarriage. This is the manifestation of that stupid fucking slogan, abortion is murder. Abortion is not murder, but the injustices targeting pregnant women and those who provide them abortion care is meant to treat them like criminals anyway. Such a country is no place to raise a child. There is no bad reason to have an abortion and no reason to force women to bear children. This has been Unfuck the Poor's extensive but not exhaustive episode on abortion, where we are, how we got here, and what to do about it. Those websites for you, once again, keepourclinics.org, abortionfunds.org, plannedparenthoodaction.org, and plannedparenthood.org. For international listeners, check out Abortion Without Borders at abortion.eu. and the Safe Abortion Action Fund, which is the only global fund focused exclusively on the right to safe abortion, at saafund.org.